Hello, this is Dr. Grande. I'm here today in the new studio making this video in a little bit more informal environment because this video is made at the time of the story that I'm talking about. It's a current issue. So I'll get right to it. This video is about the Capitol building riots, the riots in Washington, D.C. At the time I'm making this video, the story is still being updated, and I'm sure it will be for some time to come. New information will be added. A quick background here based on the reports we have so far. Starting on January 5 and continuing to January 6, 2021, large crowds of protesters who ostensibly supported Donald Trump gathered in Washington, D.C. They were there because they were not happy about the outcome of the election. Many have bought into the idea that Trump somehow was cheated in the election. The election was stolen from him. Basically, it's like a massive conspiracy theory that, logistically speaking, is essentially impossible. On January 6, people gathered and participated in a Save America rally. At about 2:15 p.m., protesters stormed the Capitol building, with several of them breaching the security and actually entering the building. Apparently, they caused a significant amount of damage inside. This was the first time this has happened since 1814. The perpetrators at that time were the British, which makes sense considering it was during the War of 1812. At the doors of the House chambers, there was an armed standoff between government law enforcement officers and protesters. One female protester was shot. She would later die. 2 explosive devices were found nearby, one on the Capitol grounds and another in the headquarters of the Republican National Committee nearby. In the afternoon on January 6, Donald Trump told the protesters to go home with love and in peace, remember this day forever, kind of implying that he thought this was a good thing or a positive day. He would make a number of other statements as well, but he really didn't appear to be particularly forceful, like he wasn't saying, this is awful, what you did is terrible, go home. Before this, Trump also said that he will never concede, and he condemned the Vice President, Mike Pence, for rejecting his idea of blocking the congressional certification of Joe Biden's victory. This is interesting because that's not even something the Vice President can do under the Constitution. Pence is literally unable to comply with Trump's request. There have been many reactions to this chain of events. Some people are calling for Trump to be impeached. Others have called it an insurrection. They said he was seditious. I'm sure a lot more will come out in the next few days and weeks. So let me offer my analysis. One of the reasons I dislike politics so much is that people will defend or reject a politician based solely on the political ideology. Like if somebody's a Republican, they support Republicans. If they're a Democrat, they support Democrats. Really, to some people who are Republicans, all other Republicans are good and all Democrats are bad. And to some people who are Democrats, all Democrats are good and all Republicans are bad. It's a very simplistic and fairly dangerous way to view the world. The reality with this political situation is that Donald Trump lost the presidential election. This was neither good nor bad. It was simply an outcome. It was what it was. It's not something that can really be revisited a million times. I think that what's healthy is to move on with the democratic process. One person winning and another person losing is actually a victory for that process. Following an election, we would hope for a peaceful transfer of power. The time to debate who should be in the executive office is postponed until the next election cycle. An election must have a definitive result. It's kind of like a jury trial. There is no jury verdict like, well, we think they're guilty, but maybe they didn't do it. A verdict is always something like guilty or not guilty. Whether a mob is filled with people who are conservative or liberal really doesn't matter. The mob mentality moves the protesters toward increasingly aggressive and irrational behavior. There are several features to the mob mentality, and many of them can be seen in this situation. Superstitions evolve in a crowd, and they can be perceived as credible. In this case, the superstition was planted by Trump, this idea that the election was stolen. A collective mood can permeate the groups. A sense of urgency is usually a part of that mood. Mobs rarely say, "I'm feeling like doing something violent. Let's do that next week or next month." It's usually about doing something now. Let's have an adventure in this moment. We see a diffusion of responsibility. Individual accountability goes out the window. There is a sense of identifying with a cause. The mob is motivated because of some ideal that they hold out as more important than reason, common sense, or logic. In the case of this mob, they bought into Donald Trump's conspiracy theory about the election. They believed that this was a great injustice. Again, they believed the election was stolen. And they thought their use of violence would allow him to stay in power. Through violence, they could achieve peace and harmony under Trump. They were willing to disregard the values of democracy to preserve democracy. That doesn't make sense to me, but it must have made sense to them. Over the years, many protesters have taken to the streets for both good and bad causes, but for these protesters, there's something particularly inspiring about getting a message, the basis of their protest, from the President of the United States. This would be like a high school teacher encouraging students to argue with one another, and then the teacher being shocked if the students started fighting. It was a logical consequence of Trump's actions that we see these riots. Trump's refusal to let this conspiracy theory go is reckless. It's not playful. It's not just fooling around. It's dangerous. Some people have suggested, as I mentioned in the past, that Trump may be a bit narcissistic. Well, this situation illustrates why narcissism is nothing to be toyed with. It seems kind of innocent and playful in the beginning, kind of an annoyance, like, oh, that person's arrogant and condescending, but it can be far worse than that. It's a barrier against reason and logic, and it does not facilitate operating within limits. The concern is that Trump will get away with as much as he can, do whatever he needs to do. He appears to be getting increasingly reckless as his time in office draws to a close. I don't think the situation with Donald Trump has anything to do with conservative versus liberal. Someone can be a loyal conservative and dislike Donald Trump. For that matter, somebody can be a loyal conservative and like Donald Trump, but still realize his behavior cannot be tolerated. The analogy I would use here would be a new police officer working for a respected police captain. The officer respects the captain in the beginning, as that would be expected. The captain orders the officer to take some liberties with the paperwork. The officer doesn't think much about that. He figures it's just part of the job. The captain tells the officer that once in a while, it's not a bad idea to frame a suspect if you know they're guilty. The officer doesn't feel too good about this, but he figures, I'll take the good with the bad. One day, the captain urges the new officer to beat up a suspect in custody. When does the officer say, enough is enough? I can no longer lend my support. The officer never stopped loving law and order, which is exactly why he would turn the captain into internal affairs. Another way to look at this, what could Trump do to turn a supporter against him? What is actually beyond the pale? For those protesters who stormed the Capitol building, the answer is nothing. There's nothing that Trump could do to lose their support. When a narcissist gains power in an organization, they destroy it from the inside. The more power they have, the more destruction they cause. They bring more pain than people even thought was possible. Trump will not be the president for much longer, and I wonder if his attitude hasn't shifted from trying to remain president, trying to essentially go back in time and win the election, to something more like, if I can't be in command of this country, I don't care what happens. He doesn't really care how much violence or destruction happens. Trump promoted a lie. He falsely asserted that the election was stolen. This deception spread through at least some of his supporters. The actions of the protesters became an expression and extension of Trump's own narcissistic rage. He felt satisfaction about their behavior, much like a narcissist who lashes out in anger feels good immediately afterward. I think this riot in Washington, D.C. reminds us that sometimes it's important to break away from politics, break away from desire, separate from the idea of political winners and losers, and remember that the values that democracies all over the world share has nothing to do with self-centeredness and grandiosity. Earlier, when I was watching the news coverage of the lawmakers in Washington, D.C. resuming their duties. In theory, they will be confirming that Joe Biden will be the next president. A lot of the speeches that were given were really by people that seemed amazed at what just happened. They couldn't believe that Trump played a part in this, and they couldn't believe the behavior of the protesters, who of course bear responsibility as well. I remember this old movie, Die Hard. I talked about this recently in a video titled, Is Die Hard a Christmas Movie? There was a scene in that movie where the character John McClane, played by Bruce Willis, gets the attention of Officer Powell. And he does so in a really noticeable, dramatic way. And after he did that, he said, "Welcome to the party, pal." That's kind of how I feel with these lawmakers. I've been dealing with narcissists as a clinician for many years. I worked with a lot of people who have strong characteristics of narcissism and other cluster B features like antisocial, histrionic, and borderline. And it's different when you're working on it from a clinical perspective. You're trying to help the person to overcome the symptoms. But that doesn't change the fact that some of those people did wreak havoc in their environments. And for quite some time, I've been saying, look, narcissism is not always dangerous, but it can be. And when it is, you really have to watch out. So that's kind of my sentiment. I feel for them, but at the same time, I kind of think, welcome to the party, pal. I've been saying this for a long time. Narcissism is a real thing. It's really dangerous. It has real consequences. And as I said, sometimes people who are narcissistic, they do have a limit and they contain how badly they'll behave, but sometimes they don't. And unfortunately, it is difficult to know when somebody has a governor on the engine, so to speak, and when somebody does not. So those are my thoughts on the riots in Washington, D.C. At the time of making this video, the area has been secured and the lawmakers are moving on with the business of the evening. I'm pretty sure that it will all get resolved in a positive way, but I hope that the lesson learned remains for some time. I think it's important time to take a look at what characteristics leaders should have and what characteristics they should not have. I think that people really need to be careful and mindful about this subject. As always, please put any questions and thoughts in the comment section. They do always generate an interesting dialogue. I hope you found my analysis on this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.